My name is Tal Kitron. I work with Applerouth and have for about 10 years now in a few capacities. My current role is a premium tutor online full-time. I tutor SAT, ACT, and PSAT for the most part. And in the past, I've worked managing premium tutors in the Atlanta area, and for a while working at a local high school in the Atlanta area. But I'm coming to you live tonight from near Boulder, Colorado. And we're going to be talking about navigating the college application and admissions process today. If you haven't already, please go ahead and fill out that welcome poll. And if you have questions today, throw them in the Q&A feature. And at the end, I'm going to aim to leave some time to answer those. So here's where we're going to start today, which is admissions has been in a new state. I guess I could put new in quotes for a couple of years now. The pandemic itself was very disruptive. And so admissions offices around the country had to adjust. And a lot of those changes have continued since then. One of the big ones is more virtual outreach. And they're still now coming back and doing the road shows and the in-person visits and interviews, which are important. But a lot of virtual events now, so many more opportunities for that remotely. More alumni outreach has been a thing for a lot of colleges, and they've had to hire more part-time staff to manage the increased application volume, which we'll talk about a little bit more. One of the big things that has changed is colleges always have to accept a bigger number of students than they are actually planning to enroll. And for years and years, it was there were patterns and they could work with those. But since COVID hit, predicting the yield both of people who will apply, how many, but then also how many admitted students will actually enroll has been hard to predict. And so because there was a full year where many people didn't have test scores, things like demonstrating interest by going to interviews that couldn't be done in person and had to be done virtually. So a lot of things were missing from their usual predictive models. And because of that, it's just been harder for colleges to predict what's happening. So that's, I think, part of just the flux that we've been seeing. And we've seen a lot of wait lists. I have seen more people come off of wait lists and get into schools this year than ever in the past. But we've been seeing longer and longer wait lists because of that uncertainty. One of the years is gap year requests. That was a thing, especially in 2020. And a gap year is something that people around the world often take. Americans often don't. But just taking a year between high school and college, I think because of that and because of uncertainty among how many people will apply and enroll, we just saw those larger wait lists that still continues now. Some of this stuff is abating a little bit, but most of it is still really quite the same in effect. And then this is something we'll have to touch on later as well, which is early action and early decision. Always big, but has really come to the forefront in the last few years. Early decision is when you commit to a school and you say, I'm going to apply here and pretty much only here early. And if I get in, I'm going to go. And then early action just puts you in an earlier pool. You're not committing to say you'll go. You're just demonstrating your own interest in that school by applying earlier, which would be like August, September, rather than October, November. And more schools have shifted towards early admissions. They're just accepting more applications, but also accepting more students, a bigger pool from the early applicants. Admissions offices are always working hard, but now they've been working even harder. Students with lower test scores who would in the past maybe say, okay, I have a 1200, which is a great score, but maybe not good enough for Harvard or Yale. But now if you can apply to those schools test optional, then maybe the student says, well, I've got a 4.3 GPA. I've got the extracurriculars, right? I'm a star student. My scores just weren't there on the tests. So they would then apply, and you'd see more and more people applying in the test optional pool. Unfortunately, with those application increases, it's not like schools got more money or employees. And so it's just been a bigger burden on them. We have less information than usual because test scores are one of the really only true way to standardize, right? A 4.3 at Westminster in Atlanta is not the same as a 4.3 at Lovett. So it's hard to standardize grades. You can do it with test scores, But when so many students were applying without SAT, ACT, that was harder. Something that you can do, and we will also discuss more how to find these ranges, but if you search for the common data set for colleges you're looking at, go back at least a few years, I would say maybe 3-4 years now, to get a better sense of that true middle 50 percentile. In other words, when things were quote unquote normal, what were the test scores of people getting in? That may have shifted a little bit higher since 2019, but it should be fairly comparable. So before we get into the testing part of this, let's talk academics. Grades are number one. Always the most important factor, right? Which makes sense because that's what takes most of our time in high school. Going to class, studying for tests, right? Building that strength of schedule. And so they're almost always the most important factor for every college reviewing apps, but A's are not as special as they once were. There's been some grade inflation. And so you hear of more students with 4+ GPAs now. What that does is it puts a little more focus on the rigor of your schedule. So AP classes and hard classes and just what is perceived as advanced, or if you're looking at STEM, the higher math and science classes. And then because grades are now inflated a little bit and not as special as they once were to have a really high GPA, testing has now become a little bit more of a factor. Because again, it's something that can set someone with a 4.2 apart from another 4.2 at a different school, or a 3.8 or a 2.7. A test score can make up for, a great test score can make up for a not so great GPA. The opposite is not always true, because a lot of schools have this certain range. If you are applying with test scores with SAT, ACT, then unless you're in that range, you're unlikely to get in. But if you have a very low GPA, your test scores are blown out of the water, sometimes that can make up for that lower GPA. And how do activities factor in? Well, they definitely do. Admissions officers right now are looking for continuity, depth, and contribution. I think demonstrating that you've got a passion and that you've been involved, but you also plan to stay involved. So what are you going to do when you come to this college? What will you bring to their campus? And I think that you have to change that for every school, right? It's going to be obvious if you just use boilerplate language. So really think about, what is it that I like about the school and what is it that makes me an attractive candidate? And if it's just you're an athlete and you feel like, man, I don't have that much else besides that, well, maybe you could write a blog, or you can do some statistical analysis, or you could help with the coaching, something like that. There are little things you can do to show the depth of your interest. And remember, if it's just, I do community service, I mean, that is wonderful, but just about everyone does. So what will set you apart? What did you do? Why were you passionate about it? What will you do with that knowledge and talent and passion down the road? And there's some discontinuity that's a given with COVID. Before about the year 2020, if you just jumped from chess to golf to tennis to hockey, some colleges would frown on that. They'd say, why didn't this person stick with something? But they now know that probably these 4-year memberships would be challenging. So try to demonstrate continuity. Let's say you couldn't play, you're a tennis player, but you couldn't play while the pandemic was ongoing for obvious reasons. So we've got varsity 9th, 10th, 12th, and then put recreational tennis in 11th grade. Don't just leave a gap. Show this is what I did and why. And I think that admissions offices will understand that. There have been extenuating circumstances. We touched on this, but demonstrated interest has become more important in the past couple of years. And we're going to talk about it virtually and in person. Both are important. And of course, virtual is often easier and more affordable. Visits, whether they are virtual or in person, will help you learn what you're looking for and also help you write a compelling essay. I think that going to a campus and envisioning yourself there, of course, is also just super important on a practical level. And if you are doing a virtual visit or in-person visit, make sure you do your homework, right? If someone says, do you have any questions for me, an admissions officer or someone at the school, you should have a couple in place. And even if it's something that you already kind of know the answer to, you want to demonstrate interest. And believe me when I say that they're taking note, right? So I believe this might be on the next slide, but if there's a virtual visit, they know who's tuned in, they know who's logged in, they'll take a note if people are engaged and asking questions. So don't sleep on demonstrating interest whenever possible if it's a school you're really passionate about. And yes, of course, on-campus events are great, but I mean, it can be impossible, whether for safety reasons, cost. Virtual events, of course, are available to everyone. And pre-registration is required. So again, if you don't click the links, if you leave early, that's something they'll get a notice about or they'll know. So just little things like that, right? Just making sure that you're demonstrating interest and showing yourself off in the best way possible. If you're doing an interview, you never want to do your first choice school first. That's just good life advice. You want to practice a little bit. You want to figure out who's going to be conducting the interview, but you also want to practice with some other schools, right? So don't let that be your first real interview. Sometimes you can, some colleges offer interviews to anyone. Other times you have to request one. I do think we've seen a few more schools putting more weight on the interview these past couple of years. It's not cost prohibitive because if you have a cell phone, right, or access to Zoom, you can do an interview online. But again, unless you can both answer and have questions to ask, demonstrated interest, you want to wait to interview until you've got those things really down and set. Letters of rec, a big thing that I remember when I was a teacher is I was always asked very late, and I would always do it, almost always, because I care and I wanted to make sure that my students had the best possibilities to open up opportunities. But I definitely didn't love it when I got a request the night before or a couple nights before. And some teachers, a lot of them just won't do it. They're too busy. So if you know teachers now that you want to write letters of recommendation for you, or that maybe you do, demonstrate to them why and ask them sooner rather than later. I will say that with the shift to online learning, some people handle that better than others. I do think that if you handled it well, or if you recognized some challenges and had a teacher that helped navigate through that or that you trust, that might be a really good letter of recommendation. If they would say, hey, this student's really adaptable, they did great when we shifted online, their enthusiasm, energy, motivation didn't change. If you are that and you have a teacher who would say that, that's a great person to ask for recommendation. And always make sure to look, like, do they require, do they recommend, or do they not even take recommendation letters? Some of the really elite colleges will ask for a bunch of recommendations. So your college counselor, and then teachers from core academic classes, junior, senior year. So that means that you really have to be thinking about it as you are going through junior, senior year of which teachers are you going to ask, and do it early. Make it easy for them too. I mean, give them, like, if there's an envelope that needs to be stamped, give them that, give them the instructions, right? Just the simpler you make it, the better your letter is going to be, because teachers appreciate that stuff. So now to my bread and butter on Applerouth, which is testing. We're just going to talk a little bit about SAT and ACT and testing in general. So let's take a look at this is from a couple of years ago, the NACAC survey of factors that influence admissions decisions. Test scores are there, but they're not first or second or third. We've got all grades, core grades, and then academic rigor, and then test scores. Huge piece of the puzzle, but certainly not the be all end all. And I always tell all my students, test scores don't define you, right? These are tests of effort, so people can always improve, but there's no real answer to what's a good score. So it depends on where we start. It depends on where our goals are, where we're applying. And all the tests are graded on a curve. So that's why it's standardized. It is important to know, though, that even though it's only one piece of the puzzle, it's an important one. It's a huge one, right? Like I said, it can make up for a little bit lower grades or less rigor. Whereas if you have great grades, great rigor, but the test scores aren't there, it's still tough to get into those elite schools if you're not going test optional, which we're going to talk about quite a bit. The black and white difference between, or in this case, orange and white difference between SAT and ACT is the SAT is more rigorous reading wise and analysis wise. The ACT, first off, is just an easier test, but it does have more rigorous STEM content. That's the only thing that I will say is a little bit harder on ACT is some tough math and data interpretation. But honestly, they overlap a lot. Roughly 80% of these tests content overlap. The ACT has a science section, but it's not really science. It's reading graphs and matching and tables and relationships and patterns. They will test, ACT will test stuff from pre-calc and maybe calculus and that level, whereas SAT won't. The ACT will also test a lot of geometry and arithmetic and trig. And really the deal with ACT is you got to know a little bit about a lot. Ever heard of a logarithm? Here's a point. Ever heard of matrices? Here's another point. Know how to do vectors? There's another one. And some people have never learned about that or have learned and forgotten is another common thing I see a lot. SAT, more advanced reading, longer passages, tougher passages, some from the 1800s, politics and history reading passages, which are harder, and then just longer and more word problems in general. But the overlap, they both test grammar and rhetoric and reading comprehension and science, graph reading and algebra, stat geometry. They have a lot of overlap. You can see even as a structure, they're similar. So the ACT sections here are out of order, but for SAT, you go reading, which is 65 minutes for 52 questions. You go writing, which is 44 minutes for 35 questions. Other way around, sorry, 35 minutes, 44 questions. And then two math sections, one that has no calculator and one that has a calculator. The SAT also has free response questions on math. So of the 58 total math questions, 13 of them are free response or grid-ins. And then there's no essay portion as of a couple of years ago, it's gone. There is sometimes what's called the Section 5 experimental, which is not counted towards your score out of 1600. It's just to gather data for future tests. With the experimental section, it's closer to 4 hours. Same with ACT, which goes English, math, reading, science. And it's much more fast paced. For example, math has 60 questions in 60 minutes. And the last two, reading and science, 40 questions in 35 minutes. So it's a breakneck speed. ACT is a test of speed. SAT is more of a test of common core knowledge. So even though there's a lot of overlap, I do think fundamentally there's some really huge differences. The ACT still does offer the essay portion, but it's optional. And honestly, the 5 or 6 schools that now require it, I really had never heard of them. So unless your school's on that list or your school that you're applying to strongly recommends ACT essay, you could probably go without it and it will probably disappear within a year or two. I think it's on the way out. Something that I'll add here is you want to decide on one test. So the best way to start the test prep journey, so if you're just thinking about that and not the college application part alone, is take 2 mock tests, one SAT, one ACT, compare results and pick which one you like better and did better on. And then you register for a couple official tests and prepare for those. Mention that ACT is a speed test. Look at the difference in time per question. Anywhere from 30 to 40% more time per question on each of these sections. Like you see in science and reading for ACT, you get less than a minute per question. That never happens on SAT, except for writing, which is mostly grammar stuff. A lot of students prefer the SAT just because of that forgiving timing. But then other students like the ACT, the fact that it's simpler and you get calculator the whole time and there's no free responses. It's all multiple choice. But people can tell a lot from taking the baseline tests, just see which one felt better. And usually it's often the scores are reasonably close, but the student likes one test more. The greatest area of divergence on these 2 tests is math. So SAT we said is common core and really just honed in on algebra. The ACT is just knowing a little bit about everything, pre-calc, trig, arithmetic, all this stuff. So for SAT, it's more like interpreting over solving and applying skills as in isolating variables, combining like terms, distributing, factoring, foiling, substituting. Almost every SAT math question has those. And sometimes they're multi-step problems that have multiple ones of those skills. Like you got to cross multiply and then combine like terms and isolate. But algebra is something that people are often quite familiar with. It's quite a few wordy problems here, many of which you don't even need to do math. You just need to understand the modeling of it and what they're saying. We got that no calc section and the free responses. The SAT math gets harder as it goes until the grid ends, and then it gets easier again. So strategy-wise, it's better to like skip to the grid ends and then go do the hardest multiple choice at the end. The SAT gives you formulas at the beginning and they never test them, almost never. The ACT tests geometry a lot, but they don't give you the formulas. So there are a few things that you have to memorize for ACT. That being said, it's more straightforward. They don't hide the ball. It'll test a concept in isolation, again, meaning, hey, have you ever learned about this topic? And if so, here's a point. Calculator, including graphing calculators. So almost any calculator at this point is allowed. All they do is they walk around during the test to make sure you've got an approved one. Unless it's a computer basically that connects to the internet, the calculator is allowed. So TI-84 is strongly encouraged. ACT math is all multiple choice, but there are 5 choices instead of 4. It makes it a little bit harder. And like we said, much broader range of concepts. And as we flesh out SAT, ACT, if you have questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A and we will address those at the end. A little bit of an extra comparison of content here. Trig is mostly an afterthought. I mean, I'd say on both tests, but especially SAT. Very rare, you'll get 1 or 2 questions about SOHCAHTOA. ACT, you'll see probably 4 or 5 out of 60. But you can see ACT's got a quarter geometry, still algebra heavy, but not like the SAT where it's a solid 60% is just algebra stuff. And then that 30% that's arithmetic or data analysis is often statistics or really just interpreting scenarios with like a scientific cap on, not really just not inferring too much. They might ask you, for example, we performed this study with this sample of people, what's the proper takeaway? Right? And you would pick an answer that's fairly gentle and doesn't say too much. What types of things do we see on ACT math? So we saw matrices. I would tell students learn how to do that on your calculator because there's a way to multiply matrices on the calculator. Working with conic sections, especially parabolas and occasionally ellipses or circles. Understanding domain versus range and extraneous solutions. Stuff like asymptotes and holes, which people have often learned recently and forgotten, which is a big thing. I mean, I always tell them, I'm in my 30s, the things that I've learned and forgotten in my life could fill a library. So there's no shame in that. A lot of ACT, SAT prep is just knocking off rust, right? And like saying, hey, if you see radians, don't think unit circle, just try to translate that to degrees. And then just math vocab, like what are monomial factors and the associative and commutative properties, which are actually very easy concepts that probably nobody has learned or thought about at all, or if at all, in years. So that's ACT math. And the question becomes then, which test should you try first? As I mentioned, try both. And Applerouth offers mock tests. I think if not, sometimes we have free events, but if not, they're quite cheap. And you can also download and print tests online. There's a free ACT, there's some free SATs. You take both of those as a real test. So you time it, you bubble in with the Scantron, you score it. If there's a score that's much better than the other, start with that. And then if not, then go with whichever one you liked better, because we're always going to be better at what we like. And then finally, if prep's not yielding results, you can switch and a lot of the content transfers. I will say that I haven't had to do that all that often, but sometimes we just hit a wall and it's like, yeah, I don't know, the SAT's not clicking. I want to switch over to ACT. And just that shift can often in itself do wonders. Ideal world, you take it 3 times. It takes most students 3 official tests to reach full potential. And so I know that seems like a lot, but like for SAT, you could do October, November, December and be done in a perfect world. The pressure of trying to be one and done, let alone that most people can't do it, it just puts undue pressure. If I think I got to get this score on this test, this is it. That's just not healthy. It's better to say, okay, I've got this test, I've got a couple more down the road. So it's lower pressure, I've got more cracks at it. And oftentimes people do better because of that. And like I said, choose a test. Don't switch back and forth. Commit to one. If you have to switch, then it's a total switch. But generally commit to one, try a couple tests, and you should see progress. Right, again, this is not a test of intelligence. There are 8 types of intelligence, arguably, and this test is only 2 of them. ACT, SAT tests some logical reasoning with math and then some verbal skills, but there's a lot of intelligence they don't test. And this is something that is not your typical exam where you can't cram for it, right? It's really just getting to know the test writers, how they operate, and understanding your own process and what feels comfortable. So a whole bunch of this is just getting to know the test itself. There are some myths about SAT and ACT. The reality is there are no consistently easy or hard dates, meaning I used to hear that, oh, I shouldn't take November because the curve is really harsh. But that's just not been proven true. So patterns vary from year to year. They're all graded on a curve with whoever you took it with at that day, at that time, that same form. But there's nothing telling me that June is an easier test than November. There's also nothing telling me that C is correct more often than B, right? So those aren't real things. The SATs to target, honestly, are March, May, and October. Those are the 3 tests each year that offer the question and answer service, meaning about 10 days after you take the test, you have online on your SAT website, if you order it, you can have every question that you got right and got wrong with a hyperlink. So like with my students, if they take the March test, 10 days later in preparation for May, we're looking at those questions they missed and going through them and saying, okay, you missed this on the real test in March. How do we make sure we get it next time? That's March, May, October for SAT, and then it is April, June, December for ACT that offer the question and answers. ACT doesn't do it online, so it's a little bit less helpful. The other thing to consider with SAT is your extracurriculars and just where you're less busy. So making sure there's not like a football game the night before the test, or making sure that you don't have like an event the afternoon of the test day. So really just we got to get into the test feeling rested, feeling healthy. That's the number one thing once you've gotten prep under your belt. What are elements to successful test prep? Different for everyone, but there's some things that always work. Mock tests help. Just getting the testing practice and the bubbling and the timing and the mental stamina. Distributed practice, meaning do not cram. I do have that with students where we assign something and then I know they're doing it the night before the session. Much more effective, especially with ACT, SAT, to spend 30 or 40 minutes each day and spread it out and come back. Start early, although if you feel like, oh no, I haven't started early, like it's never too late, right? So starting early would mean maybe for the highest scores, summer after sophomore year, thinking about the PSAT in October. For most people, fall of junior year is a good starting place. So if you're a rising junior and you're starting junior year, sometime this semester is a good time to start. And then spring is also good, but you want to make sure that summer before senior year, you're not scrambling to get a test. Finishing strong is all about working backwards from the official tests. So like when scheduling with a student, I'll make sure that I work backwards from the test date and we're leading in with at least a couple of weeks, if not 3-4 weeks in a row that we're meeting weekly and assigning stuff in between sessions to lead you into that test. And then we always want to have a goal and we want to set our goals high. So there's ways to look after you get your baseline of just kind of where you think you can rise to. But first take a mock test, see where your scores are, then set a goal based on where you're trying to get to. And the testing timelines were really funky for a while, and it was agonizing as a tutor because my students, the testing centers would stay open, and then like a couple days before the test in 2020, they would close. And then the students were out of luck. So I still think even now there are some test centers that are still closing. So it's important to register for multiple tests and do it early just in case that happens. You don't want to be in a position where You're a senior, you got to take the June and July ACT, but then for some reason the test center cancels. That being said, we've got tests now, SAT in March, May, June, August, October, November, December. And then ACT in February, April, June, July, September, October, December. That's domestically, internationally a little bit different. They only offer, I think, 3 or 4 per year internationally. A couple of changes on the horizon. So we're going to go through this, and then we're going to get back into the admissions and testing optional and all that stuff. So just so you know, some changes in early May of 2020, ACT decided that they were going to delay some of their plan changes, because what they said is they were going to do computer-based testing, which is already in place internationally. So every student I have outside the US has been taking the ACT on a computer for years. And the coolest thing that was really exciting was they said, we're going to do sectional testing, meaning if you took the ACT and only didn't do well on math, you could just take the math section the next time, which with super scoring, which we'll talk about, would have been so huge. I mean, I still think it may happen at some point, and it's a good money-making venture for ACT because a lot more people will take more tests, but it hasn't yet, and they took everything off the website. So what we don't have is any knowledge yet about when they're going to switch and if they're going to switch. The SAT, on the other hand, and just go back to super scoring in case we don't discuss, super scoring means that if you take multiple tests and different dates, many colleges will only see your highest score from each test sitting. So if you got English 22, math 25, but then the next time got English 25, math 22, super scoring would show only the 25s. And you wouldn't even have to submit both scores. The ACT automatically super scores now on their website. That is another benefit of taking the test more than once, is because you can give yourself a better score than you get in one sitting. For example, when I took the SAT, I got a 1420 with 710 on both. Then I took it again and I dipped in one section and went up in the other and got a freaking 1420 again. But most colleges I applied to super scored, meaning they didn't even know I took the test twice. I submitted both scores, and for all they knew, I had a 1480. And ACT, since it has 4 sections, is even more dynamic and can be more helpful with super scoring. So SAT changes. First off, SAT subject tests, which have been a staple for many years at the end of semesters, are no longer around. College Board also administers the AP tests, and so those are just kind of taken the place of SAT subject tests, which were for college admissions, or I should say college credit. We talked about the SAT writing portion, that's also gone. And the ACT essay is still ongoing, but like I said, really rapidly losing relevance. Why did the subject tests go away? Because really APs were just replacing them anyway. So it's good. It's one less thing that people have to scramble for and compete about. So AP exams have just kind of taken the spot of SAT subject tests. And what we know is that there's some more changes to the SAT. Every 7-8 years, they change. So class of 2025 is the first to experience this new test. So if you're class of 2023 or 24, then this doesn't apply to you. 2025 will be the first to experience this new digital SAT. And this is going to be cool. I'm excited to see the changes. Shorter, so love that, 2 hours, not 3. More time per question, so even less now. So right now, SAT is not that much of a time crunch like ACT, but it'll be even less of a time crunch, which is good. We don't need to have this be a test of speed. Shorter passages, which often just have 1 question per passage. No calc section. And then still out of 1600. And because it'll be on the computer, they're going to offer a lot more possible dates. So there should be a lot more in-school testing, especially in certain states. And like in Illinois, where I grew up, it's an ACT state. So I wouldn't see that much in-school SAT there. But in a place like, I want to say, New York, you'll probably see quite a bit of in-school SATs. And those are great. They'd be like a Wednesday where you just go in and take it in school. Really nice. They don't take the place of official tests like October, November, December. So sometimes students can actually take like an in-school test in April and then take the official May SAT a few days later. I can't think of any better prep than taking an official SAT, meeting with a tutor to think about what went wrong or what was hard, and then taking another official test days later. The other like very interesting thing about this is going to be adaptive, like some of the current grad school tests are. It's not going to be question adaptive though. So like it won't change every question, but after your first section, which will be set in place, section 2 will vary based on how you did. So you're going to see reading twice, writing twice, math twice. But after the first section, the second one will be either like easier or harder or the same based on how you did. So there's no single test form, which makes it more secure. And then that means that results from the beginning will have a big impact on your score because you're almost going into like the winner's bracket or the lesser bracket, where it's like I'm doing all the hard stuff that's in the top of the curve, or just the medium stuff where I'm already kind of topped out because I didn't make the second adaptive level. I don't know how this is going to work exactly. I think it's going to be really interesting, but I do know that we'll be on the cutting edge of it and making sure that we are adapting our materials and tutoring styles to best fit this new test when it does change. And why do it? A lot of advantages. So one thing is just SAT changes every once in a while, I think, to keep up with ACT and get more of the market share. But eliminating the need for human proctors is great. I hear horror stories about human proctors who just, they only have one job, but sometimes lose track of time or are not so familiar with the SATs. They even say something wrong, like you can't bubble it, you can't mark in your booklet or something. This eliminates those issues. We don't even need Scantrons anymore, so don't need to spend the 15 minutes bubbling that in at the outset. We talked about more flexibility, more school day tests, and then more test security, so less cheating, won't be any really leaks because the tests will be different each time. Some of the coolest things I think will be the accommodations, bigger font, different colors. I mean, things that just really need to be in place for those with learning differences. And still all the time accommodations can still be applied for. You'll get results sooner. So not like immediate gratification, like on some of these tests, like GMAT, I think is like right away, but within days, not weeks. And then the test itself, it's shorter and there's a little bit more honed in focus. It'll save students time and tutors time, just efficient process as a whole. What won't change, I mean, probably still need to take 2 or 3 official tests. I think that early on materials will be difficult because they usually roll out a few new materials, a few new tests, but we won't have a big body of work until they've administered a few of them. So yeah, I think that this is just something to track, like I said, especially for those in class of 2025 and beyond. So SAT going computer and adaptive in a couple of years. And of course, this could change. But right now, the plan is internationally, it's going to go adaptive and digital in 2023. That's next year. Same with the 8th and 9th grade PSAT and also the one for juniors, which is national merit. So that's next year. That's something. I mean, that does affect current sophomores. National merit is for the PSAT, which isn't actually that important for most students. It's something that we can talk about at the end if people have questions, but SAT and ACT are the ones that are college entrance exams. So in the US, we're thinking 2024 for this change after they pilot it internationally. And then the 10th grade PSAT will do that in spring 2024 to prepare those sophomores for the one next year. So the hardest thing actually will be high scoring current sophomores who will be juniors next year. Will be a little bit in the dark because they might have to deal with this digital SAT or PSAT without knowing too much about it. Versus students who are currently freshmen will be able to, I guess, take the 10th grade PSAT adaptively and then can take the same one junior year. So a bit of an advantage. Again, though, all this timeline could change. I do trust SAT's timeline a bit more than ACT historically. All right, so let's get into our last big thing today, which is just the test optional tsunami and what's been happening with admissions. The four main admission testing policies at the moment are test required, test optional, test flexible, test blind. In effect, taking the test has always been optional, but now it's also optional to submit. So for a school that used to require tests, if they're now test optional, you can apply with a test score, ACT, SAT, or without. What that means is, even if you haven't submitted an ACT or SAT score, your application can be complete. They're going to get a pool of applications with scores, and they'll get some without SAT scores. For those pool with test scores, of course, they'll consider them. But for the ones without, which is now, like I said, test optional, very common, dominant position in the country even still. With that, then you'll also have a pool of students who submit without scores, and so it won't be considered at all. I think that's hard to then decipher what does that mean for your chances if you submit a test score or don't. So we'll flesh that out a little bit. But the short story is it's optional, right? For a school that says it's test optional, you can submit if you like your scores and think it'll help you, or you can decide, no, my application portfolio is better without this test score. This most recent admission cycle, over 1,800 schools were test optional, which is more than 3/4 of all colleges and universities. That's up a ton, almost double the roughly 1,000 schools prior to the pandemic. And a lot of these schools that have become test optional are among the most selective colleges and universities. So big, big shift upwards in test optional. We could argue that we have returned to some semblance of normalcy, and yes, test optional does remain the dominant admissions position. So most colleges are still test optional, meaning you can apply with an SAT, ACT score, or you can choose to do so without. This was 2 years ago. And so a report that between about 2023 and 2024 and 2026, their prediction was that about 20–30% of schools would be test required, about 70% of schools would remain test optional, and 5 to 10% test blind. And if anything, that estimate has been conservative in the sense that I think there are still more than 70 schools that are test optional, more than 70%. What does that mean? What does it not mean? So test optional does not mean test blind, which means most people applying to test optional schools are still submitting. As a tutor, even though I know that there are flaws with the standardized testing industry and process, I was a bit worried. I was wondering, well, will students just stop taking these tests? But we didn't notice that. And if anything, it sadly got more competitive in a lot of ways because there was that option to not submit scores. That means the students who did felt like they had to do even better. So I had, there's certain schools where counselors were telling them, don't even submit an SAT score unless it's above a 1450, which I think is maybe a little bit overboard, but I don't know, that might be right? Maybe they have that insight. So for certain elite schools, if you're not above a 1450, maybe you don't submit. That seems crazy, but it's one of those things where different schools, different counselors will probably give you different guidance. And of course, standardized test scores still are good predictors of success in college. They always have been fairly good. And so it's still certainly considered in that pool where people are submitting tests. So the question, of course, is if it's test optional, should I submit or not? And strategy comes into play here. So first you got to take the test, see how you did, and see what the ranges are of the schools. If you have weak test scores, it's not going to help your application, right? So you can kind of say, is this in line with where the rest of my application is or not? However, strong scores should definitely be included, right? So if you're in doubt but your scores are great, of course, send them. That's obvious. And if there's holes, testing can provide more context. So like maybe you had a gap in your extracurriculars or your schedule is not that strong. Testing can certainly fill in some gaps. And let's say your high school isn't a known quantity. A test score can show preparation for college work. And big time can affect merit-based aid and placement. So scholarship money, you can definitely get some from PSAT, but the big money comes from ACT, SAT scores. And that's always been the case because schools want to raise their own perceived prestige. So if they average a 25 on ACT and you score a 30, very likely you're going to get scholarship money as a temptation to go there and raise their average scores. Again, let's say you do have test scores, you got to look at scholarships that are available. Texas Tech is test optional, but it doesn't give these certain merit scholarships unless you have a test score. So like you got to have top 10% high school rank and this high SAT score, or you got to have, in the 21st or 30th percentile of your rank and a test score. If you don't have both, then there's no scholarship money. And you can see Texas Tech is one of those where if you become a national merit finalist, which is PSAT, that's a full ride. So there are schools that if you do great on PSAT, you can get a really amazing scholarship. But like I said, generally a high SAT, ACT score is going to be more significant. We talked about how application numbers kind of went up. Selective schools became even more selective. The joke at Stanford is they're trying to get down to 0% admissions, and they're pretty close. But you can see here in 2021, as compared to 2019, all these schools dropped 3, 4, 5%, right? So like UGA, where 46% of people are getting in at this big school, now fewer than 40% are getting in. Duke almost cut in half, right? Or cut exactly in half, from 11.4% of applicants getting in to now under 6%. That's a big change. A few case studies here. What Cornell says is that if you submit a score without a test, you're in the test optional pool. And what that will do is it just raises scrutiny on the other things, which makes sense, right? It's like, okay, I don't have this test score, so that means I'm really relying on my schedule, my GPA, my extracurriculars, AP exams, essays, recommendations. Those things will all just come to light a bit more because we don't have this test score that factors in. Before the pandemic, only 4% of applicants did any sort of strategy when submitting scores. They would just take tests and they would submit them, or apply to schools that didn't require them if they didn't like them. But now almost 25% of students decided, I'm going to submit my scores to this college, but not to this one, right? Based on their test optional or test blind or test required, but also based on the score ranges, right? So that's obviously a very huge jump in strategic submitters. And it gives a little bit more work for college counselors and I think analytical thought and just collaborative approach to decide what should I do, what gives me the best chance to get into this school versus this school versus this school. What we see here is test score submission rates. So this is from, I believe, I want to say 2020. Yeah, you can see here. And look at like these, so a more selective private school. In 2019, 90% of students who applied submitted test scores. They're saying in 2020, only 60% of applicants did. Right, and that's true, it looks like across the board, whether it's private, public, less selective, more selective. It went down from like 80 or 90% of people who apply submitting test scores to now anywhere between 45 and 65%. Big drop. Major plays a role. So STEM students are going to be more likely to want to test and show off their math skills. So you can see, for example, one public research university, 59% of applicants submitted SAT or ACT, but that was only 5% of education social work applicants, whereas 75% of engineering people did. And if you think about why, it does make quite a bit of sense. So, I mean, the question then becomes, do test score submitters have an edge? The short answer is often yes, kind of. The reality is just more people got in if they submitted scores. So early rounds, for example, definitely varies by college. So this is not one size fits all, but Tufts, 57% of its early applicants did not submit test scores. And then it says 56% of students were admitted without scores versus, so that's pretty about right, actually. And Williams, you see 54% submitted scores and 57% actually had them. So that's also about right. But then look at Penn and Georgetown. 76% of its early decision admits had test scores. That's disproportional, right? Because that means that like it was closer to about a 3-to-2 ratio of who submitted, who didn't, but then it's more like a 3-to-1 ratio for those who got in. Georgetown, pretty low acceptance rate for early, 10.8%, but almost double, or at least 5% more for submitters. So yes, submitting a test score in the early rounds did have a positive impact and was more likely to make you a super attractive candidate that they want to admit early decision or early action. You can see here a little bit more data with a few Georgia and other kind of southern east-ish schools. And so like the admit rate with tests, 17%, 25%. So those people submitting SAT, ACT had quite a bit better chance just percentage-wise in their pool of getting in. That could be a bunch of reasons. Maybe there are fewer people applying with tests, but these numbers don't lie. There's a pretty big advantage at these schools with the most recent data that we have, that there's quite a big advantage to taking the tests and submitting. Got about 7 minutes left. So we got a few minutes here and then a few minutes for questions. So last little bit, should I send in my test scores with my application? I mean, we've kind of been dancing around that. Be logical. Are they going to add value? Do you want the admissions office to see them? If so, yes. If not, maybe you don't send. Some thoughts on that. This author says that one public university dean showed me admissions rates that were remarkably similar between those who submitted and did not submit test scores, except in STEM and business, where students with test scores got in at much higher rates, probably submitted at much higher rates and got in at much higher rates. So for STEM, it may matter more. Depends on the school, right? Look at the profile. You can Google and just say like University of Kentucky, 50th percentile, SAT, and they'll show you most recent data on the 25th to 75th percentile of students who got in. So on average, what are the test scores of students who are getting into these schools? If you look and you're below the middle 50th percentile, maybe you don't want to submit if you don't think it'll add, but if it's just above, then that's a closer call. If you're in the bottom quartile, probably don't submit, it won't help your application. There is a floor below which you should not submit, especially for schools like Cornell. So Sean Felton, I think, is being generous with a 650 or higher. So that's for one section like verbal or math. But if their middle 50th ranges are 680 to 760 and 720 to 800, 650 is in the bottom quartile. But what this person's saying is it still shows rigor. It still shows like it's quite solid. It's a good score. So maybe if it's fine arts or classical music, you would submit that. But for STEM, probably not, right? So that's where the strategy comes in. Go with your strengths, also good life advice. If it's upper 50% of the previous year, send it. Lower 50%, it's just something you got to check, right? It says bottom quartile, don't send, and go with your strengths, whatever makes you look like the better candidate that will boost the, I guess, prestige and image of the college that you're applying to, right? You want to make yourself an attractive candidate. And then GPA also factors in. So if you have otherwise stellar credentials, a weaker score or average score might not help. Most people do have scores that align with testing, but certainly some people don't. Some people are amazing test takers and others really struggle. So it's not totally in line. Again, for probably the fourth time in a different way, if your test scores are well below your grades, you probably won't benefit from sending them, but you could, the opposite is true, where you could get better test scores than grades and see a nice boost. And finally, individual section scores matter. So again, for STEM, if your verbal is low, but your math is perfect, that's probably a submit, right? Because that shows for the major you want to be in, math is great, and that's what they're going to care about. So not all sections, not all 1400 are created equal. And super scoring comes into play there. And so if you have one weak and one strong one, talk with the counselor. It depends on context. Call the admissions offices, ask them, right? Sometimes you get an answer. right? So if you wanted to send the C math but not verbal and you can't just send one, then that's a thing you got to look at and think about and decide on. Because admissions offices can't unsee a weak score. You don't want to submit a low test score. That shouldn't be read to discourage you from taking official tests early and often, but you don't want to submit a lower test score. If you have the option, which you usually do, just send your best scores. You can take the SAT as many times as you want, ACT too. Every school is different, so you don't have to submit to all or withhold to all. If you're on the Common App and you don't want every single college you're applying to on the Common App to see it, don't list them there, send them separately, right? You do not have to send your scores everywhere. All right, we've hit our end today. Applerouth offers test prep, that's my bread and butter, academic tutoring as well. So that's in-school stuff and AP exams and also executive function coaching. You can email info@applerouth.com or call that number. And I'll bring this up again in a moment. Some things that we've got coming up. Suddenly Senior package. So this is something, again, you can call that number for. John Cadenhead is the Senior Director of Tutor Services and person who hired me many years ago, and it's really fantastic. So I don't know if there's anyone better for an ACT, SAT countdown class. You can also just practice for yourself and just start some things. So this is just a good thing if you feel like you're running late and need a bit more perspective and guidance. We've also got this webinar series coming up September 7th, 21st, 28th. You can reserve your spot at this website, applerouth.com/academic success. Some very cool things, always really helpful. And finally, you see the contact info down here. I'm ready to answer a few questions. We got a couple minutes, and if you are need to go, feel free to, but I'm just going to answer a couple questions here. So first question is, should a student take the ACT if interested in STEM in college? I still would follow the same path that I recommended, which is take both tests and see which one's better. An 800 on math for SAT is just as good, if not better, than a 36 on ACT math. I will say, though, it might be worth reaching out to a couple engineering colleges to make sure that they haven't changed that. I do know that Georgia Tech used to only consider like 2 ACT sections. I think it was just English and math, but that's rare, and they didn't do that for SAT. So yeah, I think my short answer is take both, see which one fits better. I don't think there's a big benefit for ACT versus SAT aside from your individual preference. ACT is more prevalent in certain areas, mostly just because for historical reasons. Like the SAT started on the East Coast, so people in New York often don't even know what an ACT is, versus Midwest. I grew up in Illinois and had to take the ACT, we were required to. So yeah, I think it's just regional because of where it started and where it became popular. A couple more questions. Can we conclude the tech schools care more about scores than non-tech schools? Yeah, I think so, especially for math right now. I think that is a fair conclusion, that the tech schools care more about scores than non-tech. It's a bit of a broad brush, but I do think that's fair. And now last question, and I'll get you guys out of here. So question is about if we're assessing scores compared to ranges, people are having some trouble finding public info about range for STEM majors as opposed to general admission. My recommendation, if you're a STEM applicant and you're trying to figure out what is the actual range, is college counselor, but also don't hesitate to contact the admissions offices, whether it's by email or phone. Like they do get bombarded, but they will answer. And I just think that's the best thing is anecdotal information from college admissions officers and college counselors. But yeah, I will say, you don't want to go down like a Reddit rabbit hole. They do have some information there too, but not all reliable. So yeah, I would say contact the admissions offices and counselors and see what they think. And then a lot of it is going to be playing it by ear based on just anecdotal evidence and what you're hearing from other people. I really appreciate you guys joining today. Please feel free to reach out to Applerouth with any questions, and hope you guys have a great rest of your night and week.